Hi there. I hope you're going to enjoy the episode you're about to listen to, but before you do, you should know that this podcast would not be possible without the generous support of some of our listeners, either through our Buzzsprout website or through Patreon. I want to give a sincere thank you to Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, Steve Zank, Scott Henrich, Deborah Hilger, and Mikhail Langner. Thank you. Welcome back to the Lutheran History Podcast. Today's episode is one of those special format episodes where I am recording over a presentation. This means that if you want to see all the visuals, the images, and even the fun transitions I spent a little extra time on in this presentation, I recommend you go to our YouTube site, the Lutheran History Podcast channel. Just a note that the podcast is now linked to YouTube, so you may see the podcast episode in the podcast playlist. That will just be a single image and nothing special there. There will be a separate upload with all the visuals if you want to sit through that. That being said, if you just like to have this podcast play in the background and not really look at anything, the content here, once again, should mostly be pretty easy to follow along with a few minor exceptions. So today's episode is about Friedrich Wyneken, or Wyneken, in Baltimore. The occasion for this was just last week at the biennial Lutheran Historical Conference. I was able to present on Wyneken's time in Baltimore. Now, this kind of came out of several projects. I had written several other articles that kind of tied into this idea of contesting Lutheran identity. We previously had an article and an episode about the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung and the Lutheran Observer. I also recently published an article on the Henkelites, or the Tennesseans versus the Gettysburgians, if you want to put it that way, in the Lutheran Observer itself, which predates that previous article about newspapers contesting Lutheran identity. That may be turned into a podcast episode in the future. I also had an article and an episode about Wyneken and the Catechism, and all of these talk about either Wyneken forming a Lutheran confessional identity in both ministry and practice, or just the idea of Americans contesting Lutheran identity. Well, it all kind of comes together with Wyneken in Baltimore. That's where he is doing a lot of catechesis. That's where he's wrestling both with practical worship issues and applications, as well as discussing with mainly the General Synod Lutherans on the East Coast what it even means to be a Lutheran. And all of this is in the context of all these other projects. So now if you've listened to all those episodes or read those articles, you are primed and ready for today's presentation. Today's presentation or podcast episode is based on kind of 1.5 chapters from the Wyneken biography I've completed, and now in the early stages of hopefully having published as a monograph. We'll talk more about that in the future. It's a long process. I've talked about it before. It is still moving. It takes some time. So today we're going to talk about Wyneken in Baltimore, contesting the Lutheran identity. The main years to keep in mind is 1845 to 1850. So if you're watching the actual presentation, you'll see here an image of the inner harbor of Baltimore, at one time the absolute busiest port on the entire country of America, the United States, on the East Coast for sure. And this is where many immigrants would come first to Baltimore. This was before Ellis Island was the main intake point. Now, if you're looking at this view, there are a few things you might be able to see today from Federal Hill, where this image is taken. We have the old Otterbein United Brethren Church, basically a German Methodist-style church. We also have on the horizon St. Alphonsus Catholic church. It is a German-based Catholic church that appears in our story as well, like the Otterbein Church. Close by is the Basilica. It's the first Roman Catholic basilica in the United States. So the idea of Catholicism in Baltimore is another theme we'll talk about today. The Washington Monument is prominent. And if you were to visit Baltimore today, there's still an old shot tower, which is basically, it looks like a large funnel or smokestack. The idea was, though, if you had to make little lead pellets to shoot out of a shotgun, you didn't pour those all into individual tiny molds as you would for a regular musket ball. You would just drop some molten lead from a high height, and gravity and physics would do its job, and you get all these little tiny lead droplets, which would be like shotgun pellets. So that tower is still in Baltimore. In my neck of the woods, kind of just northwest of Madison, there's still an old shot tower that they built into the cliffside on the Wisconsin River. So you can find these things around. Nothing really to do with the Wyneken story, though, just a neat landmark in the presentation. Finally, the other landmark, which is really missing from this view of Baltimore that I'm referencing, is Zion Lutheran Church, the mother church for Lutherans in Baltimore, but we'll be talking a bit about that church as well. Next, we're going to look at a map view of Baltimore from the year 1844, so right during the Wyneken period or right before. All the stuff that we're mostly going to talk about today takes place right in the center of Baltimore, the 10th Ward, so just north of the Inner Harbor. In very close proximity, there's Zion Lutheran Church, like I said, the Mother Lutheran Church, often known as simply the German church. And then about a block away, there's the Second German Lutheran Church. This is the church that Wyneken first goes to and serves at for just a few weeks when he arrives. More on that later. It's also where he has his call from 1845 to 1850. Just south of Zion, and therefore like 2 blocks away from Second German, is the Odd Fellows Hall. Odd Fellows is this lodge, kind of a semi-secret society, actually founded in Baltimore. This is the headquarters. You've got thousands and thousands of Odd Fellows in Baltimore and in the surrounding area in Maryland and the DC area as well. Then just to the west of this area, probably 5, 6, 7 blocks away, there's the St. Alphonsus German Catholic Church, and then the First English Lutheran Church. First English is served for over 30 years by John Gottlieb Morris. We'll talk about him. And Wyneken for a while lived right across the street from St. Alphonsus Catholic Church. But he had quite a few residences. He moved around a lot, which must have been tough with a lot of small children, including the 2 newly born twins, Henry and Martin Luther Wyneken. So now just to give you a basic timeline of what's going on here in Baltimore with Wyneken. He arrives on the Apollo, a sailing ship out of Bremen, on June 28th, 1838. So Wyneken's first steps in North America and the United States are right in the harbor in Baltimore. As he's looking around for Lutherans to serve, they didn't really have any connections or references or a plan. They just knew there are German Lutherans who need a pastor. They wandered around Baltimore trying to get some orientation. Well, they met some German-speaking Christians who said, come with us. So they took him to the Otterbein Church. And their service is definitely of the stereotypical revival style. As soon as Wyneken was actually led to lead the prayer service, probably did a reading, a hymn, probably typical to what he had experienced back in Germany when he and his awakened or pious friends would kind of do at home or worship or private devotions. But then all the outcries started where people were shouting amen loudly, and Wyneken famously would say, "I don't know if this is from God or from the devil. It is certainly not Lutheran." Kind of a funny little snarky thing to say. Wyneken has a couple lines like that in our story today. But apparently this Otterbein Church had a reputation for some pretty wild worship practices. I'll read a quote here from a Methodist who would be rather sympathetic to them, you would think, from the year 1800, so almost 40 years before. This writer says that there was such a noise among them at the Otterbein service that many of the Christian people were immeasurably frightened. And as there was no opportunity for them to escape at the door, many of them went out the window. So they're jumping out the windows of the church. He says the noise has alarmed hundreds of people who were not at the meeting, and they came running to see what was the matter. So rather disruptive and frantic worship style. So that wouldn't cut it for Wyneken and his partner, fellow pastor, Wolf. They did find the pastor of the Second German Lutheran Church, who at this time was Pastor Johann Haysbert. Now, he had actually just led the exodus of the more conservative, more Orthodox Lutherans from the Zion Church just a few years before, just 3 years before, to found the Second German Lutheran Church. So Haysbert is considered to be a rather staunch, steadfast Lutheran, at least in comparison to other Lutherans in the area. And at first he's a little upset that Wyneken was hanging out with the Methodists, and he was staying at another German Methodist pastor's home. Not a good first impression for a guy like Haysbert, but pretty quickly Wyneken, just by talking with him, wins Haysbert over. The relationship gets only better as Haysbert gets sick physically, but Wyneken fills in and preaches for Haysbert, covers a vacancy for 6 weeks at Second German Lutheran Church. So that builds an early friendship and connection between the two men, which will lead to further developments for Wyneken. Haysbert's part of the Second German, he is part of the Second German Church, but he's also part of the Pennsylvania's missionary committee. So he connects Wyneken with them, and that's how he's sent out to Fort Wayne. Well, after several years in the Fort Wayne area on the frontier, Wyneken realizes almost immediately that there are far too few German Lutheran pastors for the vast populations of German settlers, pioneers, immigrants. They need more pastors. And he tried to send letters, he tried to coax and try to kind of goad people into action, and he always got just a small trickle of pastors or teachers arriving on the frontier, not at all keeping up with the population explosion. And that's just in the north half of Indiana. There are many other areas where this trickle of pastors wasn't even taking place. So Wyneken decides to return to Germany in October 1843, a few months before the General Synod gets wind of Wyneken's plans, and without him asking for anything, they give him their full endorsement for his trip back to Germany, which we'll see later is a little ironic. Well, after a year and a half in Germany, I misspoke earlier, he left in the fall of 1841. He comes back in July of 1843. And after first arriving in New York, he and another Lutheran pastor, Pastor Bevend, arrive in Baltimore, and they both have an opportunity to preach at the Second German Lutheran Church, where Haysbert still is the pastor. And people noticed that apparently Wyneken seemed a little more firm in his Lutheran convictions. I don't know how much you get out of one sermon, but it was noteworthy. So Wyneken is out in the Fort Wayne area for really just a year and a half until around Christmas time. Haysbert resigns his call and heads south to New Orleans, and from there to Brazil, where he's a Lutheran pastor for many more decades. But Second German needs another pastor. They have issues with their neighbors down the road at Zion Lutheran Church. Possibly because of Haysbert's influence, they aren't looking for your average General Synod pastor, but they remember this German guy, Wyneken, who made a good impression on them just those few weeks he had been preaching with them before, and his return journey back from Germany. So they call him, and we'll get into the details of that call. Just for the overview now, he is installed on March 9th, 1845, by Pastor Daniel Kurtz, who is 81 years old, rather elderly, but he had been filling in the vacancy. He was the former pastor at Zion before it started to head in a direction that the members didn't like. So he was the old pastor that the old members of Zion preferred, and he got along well enough with them at least to fill in that vacancy and to install Wyneken. So another thing we'll talk about today is also Wyneken as officially a member of the General Synod for the first 7 years of his time in America. Went to the General Synod Convention in Philadelphia in May of 1845, and there he calls out General Synod leaders and writers like S.S. Schmucker and Benjamin Kurtz, who happens to be the nephew of that aforementioned Daniel Kurtz, and a few others as well. We'll talk about that a bit later. Needless to say, that didn't go well. Wyneken didn't turn the General Synod around to his point of view, at least not entirely. So in September of 1845, Wyneken then leaves Baltimore and heads to Cleveland, where he is one of the leaders of this, you could say, a pre-founding meeting of the Missouri Synod. The Missouri Synod does officially form in the summer of 1847, just 2 years later. Wyneken misses out on that meeting and earlier meetings in 1846, just mostly because of distance. But he does lead his congregation to vote to join the Missouri Synod later in 1847. Wyneken's time in Baltimore doesn't last all that long, just 5 years. Early 1850, he accepts a call to serve at Trinity in St. Louis to assist none other than C.F.W. Walther there as pastor. And within a few months, Wyneken is then elected as Synod President of the Missouri Synod. Wyneken's time, or at least his connection with Baltimore, isn't severed, though, by this. He keeps in contact with several members, and his first son-in-law is a part of this family that he lived with in Baltimore. When he died in 1876, Wyneken had no less than 6 memorial or funeral services from coast to coast, from San Francisco to St. Louis to Fort Wayne to Cleveland, and the last memorial service was held by a former student among some of his former members in Baltimore. And that kind of ends Wyneken's connection with Baltimore right there at his death. Now, the story that we're telling today is very interesting just because of the kinds of sources that we have available. We have quite a few letters from a member at Second German Lutheran Church, Alexander Einwächter, who was almost exactly the same age as Wyneken. He lived a bit longer than him, but the Concordia Historical Institute has at least the envelopes of these letters, and then on the back of them are written rather detailed summaries of what these letters contained. So a lot of personal views as well as talking about current events and church things as well. So the famous biography of Wyneken has been out in translation for about a decade or more now, was by Johann Lindemann. Now, Lindemann was a good historian. He used Einwächter's letters, public records, synod records and such, but he also had lived with Wyneken in Baltimore for a few years when he was a teacher at Wyneken's school. So he was both a co-worker and a co-inhabitant, if that's a term you could use, with Wyneken, and that gave him a personal insight and personal knowledge of Wyneken as a pastor, especially in Baltimore. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we have the remarks of Wyneken's son-in-law, Jacob Buehler, or Beeler. He was a young boy at the time Wyneken was in Baltimore. He was about to be confirmed by him, but then he went over to St. Louis for prep school and was confirmed there by Walther. But Buehler also lived with Wyneken in St. Louis, and that's likely how he got to know the oldest daughter, Louise, and marry her. So we have his perspectives as well. So all rather primary stuff, intimate knowledge of Wyneken, especially in regards to Baltimore. So we have a rich record here. Also had access to the records of Second German, later St. Paul's Lutheran Church. And if you just spend time kind of browsing through newspapers like the Baltimore Sun, newspapers.com, there's a lot of interesting stuff. A few direct quotes of Wyneken himself, or references to him at least, or his church, but a lot of interesting religious context to what's going on. One of the things we'll talk about today towards the end is the Oddfellows movement and Wyneken's interaction with them. A lot of interesting stories about the Oddfellows. Now, a later pastor at kind of a daughter church of Wyneken's church, Pastor Engelbert, wrote a short church history, and he said it would require pages and pages to report Wyneken's work during his pastorate. Again, just 5 years there, but he got a lot done, made a huge impact. So we're just going to cover a few things today, focusing on defining Lutheran identity. We're going to talk about how Wyneken defined Lutheran identity at the Second German Evangelical Lutheran Church, how he helped to do that at the General Synod, or at least attempted to, how he wanted to define Lutheran identity as he was there to form the Missouri Synod. Not too much about that today, but it's mentioned that he was active in the pre-founding of Missouri while he was in Baltimore. And then defining Lutheran identity really in stark contrast to the International Order of Odd Fellows. The acronym looks like big OOF, which is interesting. And then the Red Men and the German sportsmen and other lodges as well. So Wyneken had to confront the challenges these lodges were making to Lutheran identity. No time in my presentation at all, and sadly really no time in our presentation today for the podcast to talk about Wyneken and education in schools, or about his work as preaching or as a pastor, or his defining Lutheran identity in contrast to the Methodists. But I pretty much have had articles or episodes on those topics earlier, so we've covered that at least tangentially. Now first, we want to talk about this idea of Lutheran identity within the local congregation. As I mentioned earlier in that timeline overview, Zion Lutheran Church, somewhat officially founded in the year 1755, was the mother German Lutheran Church. And by the time Wyneken got there, there were two, maybe three other Lutheran churches in town, but Zion was still considered the big one. So according to a church historian, in 1955, for the bicentennial history of the congregation, he talks about Pastor Haysbert as one who, quote, attempted to swing the church over into orthodoxy, yet he encountered an opposition which was just as violent as his own actions. So it kind of sounds like physics, right? For every action, there's a reaction. So Haysbert, at least the way this is portrayed here, seems to have come in kind of like a bull in the china shop, saying, I'm going to shake things up and set things straight. You could say, failed to make the Zion congregation an Orthodox Lutheran congregation. There was very little confessionalism in the congregation. He, at the very least, won a significant minority of members to leave with him and found the Second German Lutheran Church. They had probably over 300 voting members, so just adult males at that time, who were part of that congregation. So a very significant portion of the congregation did fall in line with Haysbert. Now, the author of this History of Zion talks about the three pastors during Wyneken's time. We have the old Daniel Kurtz, who installed Wyneken. He was labeled as a pietist, so conservative in some way, but maybe not focused on the particulars of doctrine necessarily. Maybe focused more on captivating preaching. He was noted for being an excellent preacher that kind of tugged at your heartstrings a bit. Then you have the old Lutheran Haysbert. We know how that went. And then the pastor who came after Haysbert's very short time was Pastor Scheib, and he's labeled in the church history as a rationalist, and that term shouldn't be used lightly, and nor is it used lightly here. He had the congregation really drop the name Lutheran. They edited the Constitution to consider the purpose of the church to be the propagation of, quote, reasonable religiosity. So very much looking down upon anything miraculous or supernatural, sacramental. All that stuff was out the window. He wanted people to use their minds to figure things out. So not so much a trust on God's word, but on man's ideas was the flavor there. So you can see why the Second German Lutheran Church, especially with Scheib's time, stood in stark contrast already by the time Wyneken arrived. Now, at first, Haysbert only had 150 members leave Zion in protest. Like I said later, it grew by the time Wyneken got there. They built their building It does not look like a church building if you're looking at the image that we're used to. It looks like a storefront or something else. No steeple, I guess, is maybe the main thing that stands out, or it's not a cruciform shape. We'll talk about some of that stuff in a different episode about Lutheran church architecture, but it's a meeting hall, basically. But one thing does stand out from this building is there's a huge capstone that's facing the main street that says Second German Evangelical Lutheran Church of the Unaltered Augsburg Confession. They're making a statement quite visibly that they are a confessional Lutheran church, at least in contrast to their neighbors down the road. Now, Daniel Kurtz, the elder, the pastor who had retired in the 30s, which led to Haspert very quickly coming and going from Zion, and then Scheib coming after him. Kurtz was apparently, quote, very aggrieved by what had taken place at his old congregation. So he hung out with the Second German crowd a little bit, but then he eventually just went to the English Lutheran churches, especially the one led by Pastor John Gottlieb Morris. So even though he was considered an old German pietist, he would rather go to the more conventional preachings of Lutheranism. So that takes us up to 1845. Haspert's left. Wyneken gets the call to Second German. Now, Wyneken is aware of sometimes the mild or shifting views of Lutherans and what's important, what's not important, but he's saying, I want to at least conduct the means of grace in a Lutheran way. So in his letter, acknowledging that he's received the call, he says, if I'm going to accept it, he says, quote, I must have the freedom to use a genuine old Lutheran agenda, particularly for baptism and the Lord's Supper. So the congregation said, sure, no problem. After all, we are the real Lutherans here in Baltimore, at least the real German Lutherans, at least the real Lutherans compared to what's going on there at Zion. So they thought this wouldn't be a problem. Wyneken was then compelled to take this call, although it was with struggle, apparently, that he left his congregations in Fort Wayne and Friedheim. And remember, this is where his wife's family has settled. He's leaving his in-laws and his wife's family connections, which we don't talk about his wife, Sophie Buch. Now, Wyneken too much, but remember, she had just gotten married, had their first child when she was still 18 in Germany with her in-laws, so away from her immediate family, spent a year and a half in Germany, and then just barely had a year and a half with her parents and siblings, and now is leaving the beautiful countryside around Fort Wayne to the hustle and bustle of what's sometimes called a very dirty city of Baltimore. So, but she went along with this willingly. Lindemann says that she was a very supportive wife in all of this. Well, Wyneken's time in Baltimore after he was installed, the very week after, would have been Palm Sunday that year, and according to other records, it seems as if Second German only celebrated communion about 3 times a year. So it seems as if this Palm Sunday was one of these big days. It was a high point for these people, even though they celebrated not very regularly, by at least modern confessional Lutheran standards in America. It was still something that was very important to them. Well, what does Wyneken realize as soon as he steps out from the sacristy into the chancel that Sunday morning? Well, he sees the communion preparations, and he is horrified by what he sees. He sees the wine in an earthen jug and the bread in a loaf right next to individual communion wafers. You know, some people today might say, well, what's the big deal? Isn't that an adiaphora? Isn't that up to Christian freedom to decide exactly how the bread is distributed? Well, for centuries and centuries, the Reformed had wanted to make a distinction from the real presence teachings of the Bible, of Lutheranism. So they shied away from wafers, unleavened bread, and wine in a chalice. They had a more, sometimes just a simple memorial kind of eating, a symbolic kind of eating. Now, other Reformed doctrine might trying to make a case for, well, there's a spiritual real presence. It depends on who you ask. But for most Americans, even American Lutherans at this time, they held a very low view of the sacrament. And what seems to have been happening here at Second German was the compromise position. If you'd rather have a more Lutheran-style communion experience, well, go ahead. You can receive a wafer when you come up. If you kind of prefer the Reformed way of thinking about it, you can have it in the Reformed style. We allow both to stand here at Second German. Now, Wyneken, so there's a problem here, and the members claimed ignorance about this. They said, we have no real idea about what's going on here. This is not something that we are familiar with, that having the bread in different kinds would be something that means we're not really Lutheran. Well, Wyneken said, okay, we'll go ahead as planned today. He was, again, being a pastor who was very often concerned about individual conscience. But he says, we have to address this issue, and I'm a little concerned, because if I come in here, I know you guys have this history. He doesn't quite say that, but he would know, of course, the history of Hay Spirit coming into Zion like a wrecking ball and shaking things up and causing division and leading people away into Exodus. And Wyneken, in the back of his mind, is surely thinking, I don't want to do this again and cause another split, another breakaway congregation. These poor people have been through this already. They probably don't want to go through it again. So he says, I'm willing to resign right here and now, because if I am going to stay, as I said in my call acknowledgement letter, I will be a genuine kind of old Lutheran, and especially the practice of the sacraments, right? So the congregation said, no, we need you to stay. We want you to stay. We'll go through this with you. So Wyneken then declared that, then the next Sunday, I will be going through both of these catechisms. I'll take the Lutheran and Heidelberg catechisms with me up to the pulpit and read and explain both of them starting next Sunday. Then each one can see for himself on which side the full truth of the divine word is found. So Martini Lutheran Church, kind of central Baltimore today, one of these daughter congregations, still has a communion cup, the common cup, the chalice, from Wyneken's time at Second German there as a daughter congregation, and they call it the Wyneken Cup today. So even today, that heritage of Wyneken standing up for the true biblical Lutheran position on communion is part of the oral history of these congregations in this area. So what happened? About 80 members did leave, and that litmus test, you might say, of how communion is practiced turned out to be true, turned out to be valid to some degree, because those 80 members formed not just a union congregation, not another kind of Lutheran congregation. They formed a straight-up Reformed German congregation. So there were, it was a union congregation, and at least in practice. But Wyneken now had fought that battle for Lutheran identity in his congregation. He would still continue to fight that battle, but that first skirmish, you might say, that first episode over the practice of communion had ended more or less well, even though there were some losses. Now, the next main arena, the main battleground for contesting Lutheran identity, took place in May 1845 in Philadelphia. This is where the General Synod was having its convention. Now, why was Wyneken going to a General Synod convention? Many of you may know, if you've been keeping up with my work on Wyneken, his time out west in Indiana. He was sent out as a member of the Pennsylvania Ministerium's Missionary Society. Pennsylvania Synod was not part of the General Synod. However, Wyneken's immediate predecessor in Fort Wayne, Jesse Hoover, had joined General Synod-affiliated synod, a kind of a baby, brand new synod, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the West, which was in Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Illinois, and Missouri. And there's a joke somewhere that they basically claimed everything west of the Mississippi too, for that matter, because no other Lutheran synod had even been established there yet. So it's kind of a joke. They didn't really have any presence outside of a few places in Missouri, but a big, you might say today, southeastern Midwest kind of synod. Well, anyway, this synod, part of the General Synod, had selected Wyneken to be one of its several delegates to the General Synod in 1845. Wyneken had kind of skirmished with the Synod of the West people about Lutheran identity the last two conventions. So he was probably thinking, well, this is an opportunity for me to testify to the true Lutheran position on many issues, or just at least bring up this concept of being a genuine Lutheran. What does it even mean? What does it even look like? In his famous Notruf, or really the full title is Die Not der Deutschen Lutheraner in Nordamerika, Wyneken had 5 sections listing the current situation in America and the big obstacles. And next to Methodists and Roman Catholics, he identified General Synod Lutheranism as being one of the main issues, one of the main threats, one of the main causes of distress for the German Lutherans in America, primarily because they're very zealous, he said, about the name Lutheran. They somewhat ignorantly attack genuine Lutheran positions. So when they turn to their anti-Catholic polemics, especially regarding things like the sacraments or even confession or maybe some anti-liturgical things here and there, he says they just come off as foolish because while they think they're attacking Catholicism, they use such broad strokes and kind of sloppy language that they're also attacking, in a way, the genuine Lutheran view of the real presence, or baptismal regeneration was a topic that's talked about a lot too. So they're undermining the true Lutheran position. So he would say in the Notruf, the distress of the German Lutherans in North America, in that very famous and influential pamphlet, he would say these General Synod people sin more out of ignorance and weakness than out of malice. They said they actually want to be Lutherans, they just don't know any better, basically. Wyneken was starting to learn the hard way out west in Fort Wayne that, well, maybe they do know better, but they just don't care about what the Lutheran confessions say, or they don't even care about biblical arguments. Some of them just care about being like the other Protestants. They care about being more popularly accepted by their fellow non-Catholic Christians. And that's a little telling that the first Lutheran dogmatics textbook by Schmucker for the Gettysburg Seminary is called Popular Theology, right? What is common, what is broadly accepted, what will be well received by the general populace. It's popular theology, not Lutheran or biblical or confessional or any of those other things that Wyneken and his friends would have liked. Well, needless to say, Wyneken's sometimes harsh but sometimes charitable criticisms of the General Synod was not well received by those in the General Synod once they read about it or heard about what he said. So Wyneken did not make it to the first few days there at the General Synod Convention in Philadelphia for unknown reasons. He appeared about halfway through, but before he got there, they resolved to send delegation to Germany. Part of it was for an ecumenical kind of church union plan. They'd also stop in England, I believe, on this trip, but they also wanted to make sure that they would counteract the influence of Wyneken's document. Now, they didn't mention Wyneken or his document by name, but John Gottlieb Morris, again, fellow Baltimore Lutheran pastor, wrote in his memoirs that everyone had a specific man in mind. This was, he said, quote, designed to counteract the influence of the representations concerning our church, which had been made in Germany the year previous by Reverend Mr. Wyneken. So that's what they had resolved to do. Well, what did Wyneken do when he finally got to the Philadelphia Convention? He spoke out against several issues, one being embracing the American Tract Society, so kind of an American missionary society. It's kind of like non-denominational today. Well, we're not one particular denomination, but it was dominated by Calvinists, by the Reformed, right? And they claimed, well, we never put anything in there that's particular to one denomination. And maybe that was a genuine statement, but your theological worldview, your theological framework can permeate a lot of things that you don't even realize would go against, say, like a Lutheran position on conversion or things like that. So Wyneken said this isn't wise or safe for us to be endorsing this or using it. they passed a resolution saying, well, the whole German population is very grateful to the American Tract Society for having some German tracts. And Wyneken is probably one of the best representatives of the actual German population in America, protested this. He also protested the use of a reformed perspective on the history of the Reformation being officially endorsed. A certain book was highly praised and quoted, and he said, this isn't coming from our point of view. We shouldn't be promoting this as a good, unquestionable resource for the history of the Reformation. So he spoke out a few times, and I don't know exactly at which time he was speaking out that this quote comes from, but apparently he tried to speak in English because this was predominantly an English-speaking body at the General Synod, and someone said, well, enough of us know German, kind of implying, though, that we don't really care to hear what you say, but just say it in German if it's easier for you. And Wyneken came out with this kind of snarky quote. Again, he said, never mind that. You've so often heard what was incorrect in good English, it will do you no harm to hear what is right, even though my English may not be correct. So Wyneken had learned English as a schoolboy in Germany. Now he was growing up and educated in the Kingdom of Hanover, which until really the year before he came to the United States was in personal union with the King of Great Britain. So in other words, the King of Great Britain, since the early 1700s, was also the Elector of Hanover. After the Napoleonic Wars, Hanover was elevated to the Kingdom of Hanover. So King George III and IV and William IV were all kings of Hanover. So there's a close English connection there. But apparently Wyneken still struggled a few times, as most people with a second language would do. Well, nonetheless, Wyneken had a bigger fish to fry, a bigger target. Towards the end of the convention, he stood up and attempted to propose a resolution. He first proposed that the General Synod there on the convention floor renounce and reject the writings of Benjamin Kurtz, especially most of his writings in his newspaper that he was the editor of, the Lutheran Observer, which we mentioned in earlier projects. A lot of his writings, like on infant baptism or a book called Why Are You a Lutheran? And then he would also turn against Schmucker and say we must also vote to disavow Schmucker's popular theology. Other books like that. And he also called out Charles Weil and his Lutherische Hirtenstimme, which was a German language newspaper, much in the spirit of the Lutheran Observer. Well, as you can imagine, that was not well received. They didn't even give a second to that resolution. I don't even think they entertained looking for a second to that resolution. Someone objected and said, well, technically the General Synod has no right to disavow these writings since they're not official writings of the General Synod. And Wyneken would later call this evasive sophistry, right? You're just using a technicality when everyone knows these two are major leaders and figures in the General Synod. The General Synod uses these books officially and all their affiliated synods and the seminary and all that stuff, but you can pretend you have nothing to do with it. Well, then he said, well, if you're not going to officially reject these as un-Lutheran, at least send these to be peer-reviewed by our Lutheran peers in Germany who are trained at actual universities, who actually have earned a doctorate, unlike all these honorary doctorates that are running around in the General Synod. Well, they didn't like that either, didn't entertain that motion or seek a second. So Wyneken was shot down in his attempt to rather aggressively redefine Lutheran identity, and maybe he had hoped that they would spark a debate and then say, what do you mean? What's wrong with say, Kurtz's book on infant baptism, and maybe he had been prepared to actually speak on it. So he was a bit aggressive, confrontational with those resolutions. But that charge of heresy is a pretty serious charge, and they didn't really take the time to even discuss it. They just swatted those motions down. So Wyneken later wrote to Wilhelm Leah that, quote, I had to repeat publicly that she, the General Synod, cherished wrong teaching and practice, and as an honest man and a Christian, as ridiculous as it might seem that I, a single insignificant man, publicly declare war on her, that I would do everything in my power to work against her influence, especially that I wanted to sound the warning about them, and that the few in Germany who stand on the side of truth will not get involved with her. So, Leah, an influential Lutheran leader, known to many of our listeners, then responded that based on the official records of the General Synod, he said, quote, "One might think that nothing had happened. But clearly something had happened. As Morris would recall later, and as Wyneken reported, that he had made a stand. But there was absolutely no mention in the General Synod minutes of any of Wyneken's proposals or any discussion, however brief they may have been. Nothing in the record. So Leah commented on Wyneken's two proposals. He says, the first proposal could not be accepted without a certain disapproval. The second could not be chosen without either lying or proceeding to total reformation in teaching and practice. So those are Leah's comments on Wyneken's proposals. He said you would have to either be disingenuous or you would actually have to do something, and most people don't like doing that. So others have noted this episode in Lutheran history in America in the book Lutherans in Crisis. We had a previous podcast episode about that. David Gustafson says that Wyneken's stand at Philadelphia was, quote, the first confessional voice heard aloud, end quote. So that, based on my other articles, maybe isn't true in a very literal sense, right? Wyneken spoke out at several Synod of the West meetings. But as far as the General Synod is concerned, in convention, yes, this was probably the first time someone had just stood up and called the issue of Lutheran identity into question for the General Synod. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, also, you have these newspaper articles talking about this as well. So the people at the General Synod weren't totally ignorant that there were other Lutherans, even Lutherans in the United States, who called them out for not being Lutheran in their teachings and practices. But they assumed that they were the vast majority position. Even during the convention, Schmucker gave a lecture, and he called these dead Orthodox Lutherans, he would use that phrase, a small minority, as if to imply because they're a minority, they don't matter. He also said it's mostly a foreign element among us. And at this time, nativism, xenophobia is a big movement in America, and Schmucker shamelessly tapped into that way of thinking. Well, it's foreign, it's not American, therefore we can dismiss it or even look down on it as something dangerous. Well, if you look at the Lutheran pastors who are in Baltimore, we actually have the reactions of, or the views of, three of them on Wyneken's stand, three other pastors. We talked about Charles Weil being one of the targets of Wyneken's proposals, saying that he too, like Schmucker, like Kurtz, is promoting un-Lutheran views. So Weil in his paper rephrased the narrative here a little bit. He had said that Pastor Wyneken spoke against the teachings of the Lutheran Church. So he was assuming whatever the General Synod said was Lutheran. Anything that they didn't approve was not Lutheran. So he said Wyneken's the real non-Lutheran here. Well, CFW Walther gets wind of this. Some of these things are making it into the press, especially Charles Weil in his Lutherische Hirtenstimme. Walther and others in the Missouri Synod, or the pre-Missouri Synod, I should say, are reading this and picking up on this Lutheran identity battle taking place in the General Synod. And Walther commented, quote, he says, "This report seeks to make the reader believe that Pastor Wyneken has been an enemy of the Lutheran Church, while all the friends of that church had looked hopefully to him as a courageous witness to the same." So Walther, much like Leah, is saying the framing of this either implies nothing important had happened or that Wyneken was actually the enemy. But Walther asked, in contrast to Weil, who had said that Wyneken was being kind of ridiculous about this, Walther said, how could the distinction between pure and false doctrine be ridiculous? So as mentioned just a minute ago, Schmucker kind of tapped into this xenophobic, anti-foreign viewpoint that men like Wyneken, he implied, don't really represent us or shouldn't be taken seriously or should even be viewed as a threat, while very much aware of Wyneken's reforms in the congregation, especially regarding communion. Picked up that old, tired line that, well, that looks Catholic or that seems Catholic, and he just connected the dots and made an assertion. Wyneken was supposedly, according to Weil, just a Jesuit in disguise, someone who wanted to lead his whole congregation and anyone else he could get his hands on into the Catholic Church. It got pretty ridiculous, but also shows how far many so-called Lutherans in the General Synod had basically become Calvinists. Others said that Wyneken was being a Catholic simply for sharing a carved nativity scene with his own children that he had received from a friend in Germany. As many of you know, the Calvinist Reformed view takes quite a literalist Old Testament view and is a different set of commandments than we do. Their second commandment is all about not making images, right? They don't like having images, and if you have an image of anything, it must be an idol against God's commands. So Wyneken was a Catholic for having a nativity set, at least according to some people. Wyneken was also accused of being a Catholic for having a crucifix, for having candles, because he used wafers, and because he encouraged private confession. So Catholics then started to get wind of these reports. As I mentioned earlier, Wyneken lives right across the street from the German Catholic Church in town, and one of the Catholic priests one day knocks on his door and meets with Wyneken in his home, thinking, well, I hear this guy's going Catholic. How can I grease the wheel, so to speak, and make this happen? And this priest, we don't know who it was, but there are a few priests at St. Alphonsus during this time. One of them was the very famous John Newman. If you know your Catholic history in America, that he's a big name there. So it may have been this rather influential German Catholic leader. But Wyneken had a curt conversation with them, apparently, and they never came back again. So Lindemann, Wyneken's biographer, who lived with him shortly after this time, recalled that Wyneken, quote, hated the papacy from the bottom of his heart, end quote. But this wasn't just this xenophobic kind of conspiracy theory where many of the nativists in America feared that all these German and Irish Catholic immigrants are going to take over our schools in the country, and now we're going to listen to the Pope. It's not coming from that perspective, but rather about justification, the assurance of salvation. Lindemann summarized Wyneken's views, saying that Roman Catholicism, in Wyneken's mind, makes the state of grace uncertain for the sinner. It extols the work of man as sufficient for reconciliation with God, and it perverts the scriptures and robs God of honor. So those are the reasons why Wyneken could be labeled anti-Catholic, but much more from a traditional confessional point of view, not just from external practices that may actually have some deeper biblical sacramental meaning. So another Lutheran pastor perspective in Baltimore that we have is from John Gottlieb Morris. So he was there at the General Synod. Morris was a lifelong General Synod person. He was even General Synod president for quite some time. Yet initially, Morris was very much sympathetic to Schmucker and Kurtz's view, despite what some people have tried to do somewhat more recently, talking about Kurtz as having it out for, Morris having it out for Schmucker personally, trying to psychoanalyze him kind of amateurishly. No, Morris was very proud of Schmucker at first. When he was going to Germany to counteract Wyneken's influence, Schmucker and Morris were that team that went over there. Morris at first was trying to boast about Schmucker's great intelligence and education, and compared to these German university profs, Schmucker was really just nothing more than an average university grad. But to Americans, he had slightly more education, and therefore he seemed more educated. The real thing that turned Morris around, though, and got him to start thinking that Wyneken was onto something, was that when Schmucker and others were trying to present the so-called General Synod view of the Lord's Supper, everyone was surprised and said, well, why are you even calling yourselves Lutherans? You should just be Calvinists. You should just be Reformed, because that's exactly what you teach is what they teach. You're not teaching or believing the Lutheran view on these things and other things as well, like the Sabbath. So why are you doing this? So Morris then would say of that journey to Germany, which was meant to counteract Wyneken's reports, he says, never was a more senseless blunder committed, because by going there in person and sharing what they actually taught and believed, they only confirmed Wyneken's reports. So Morris would blame Schmucker's early training, especially going to a Presbyterian university at Princeton, with kind of feeding him with anti-Lutheran doctrine. Now, in a book about Morris by Michael J. Kurtz, I have no idea if he's related to the famous Kurtzes of Baltimore we've already talked about. He is trying to say that Morris had kind of the psychological issue with Schmucker, and he was always jealous of him. But I don't think that is the case. Kurtz reported of Morris, he said, quote, at the General Synod meeting of 1845, Morris was for the last time standing publicly with Schmucker and the American Lutherans. And all this marked Schmucker's final successes within the General Synod. So Kurtz points out that this 1845 convention likewise was a turning point, similar to what David Gustafson had pointed out. But what Kurtz doesn't do is mention Wyneken, which is interesting because Morris is the one who gives us the most information about Wyneken there at Philadelphia. So he's silent, he's absent from Kurtz's telling. So Kurtz's narrative is Morris's jealousy against Schmucker. The evidence, though, from Morris himself seems to imply that Morris was at first inclined to be against Wyneken and for Schmucker, but that trip to Germany shook him up a little bit. He had assumed that the General Synod Lutherans were real Lutherans, and then he realized that there were some issues. So Morris would then go and visit Wyneken in his home a few blocks away, and they would talk about these things. And no doubt this led to Morris becoming more confessional. Like I said, Morris was always part of the General Synod, but he definitely wanted to bring the General Synod back to a more confessional Lutheran point of view, by somewhat different standards, of course, than what we would see in the General Council or the Synodical Conference. But Morris at least said, hey, we have to at least get baptism and the sacraments correct, and other things as well. So what was Wyneken doing in the meantime? Weil's comments, especially talking about the congregation being led to Catholicism by Wyneken, meant that Wyneken's battles for Lutheran identity in his congregation were not over. So he imported quite a few editions of the Book of Concord, the collection of the confessional Lutheran writings, and he had his congregation kind of work through the whole thing. And he said, this is what we believe as Lutherans. Can we all subscribe to this, right? So remember on the building, they had said, unaltered Augsburg Confession. He's saying, guys, that's good. Do you actually know what it says? And also there's some other confessional writings that we should base our confession on. So the first meeting did not end with consensus in 1846, but they continued to work through the issue. So in 1846, the congregation did have a meeting to discuss accusations against Wyneken's doctrinal positions. Several members had published a pamphlet called, quote, The Distress of the Second German Evangelical Lutheran Congregation of the City of Baltimore. So this title was an obvious pun on Wyneken's distress of the German Lutheran Americans, Lutheran North Americans. So that was meant to be a pun on what Wyneken had done. But all attempts at comedy aside from these members, this was a rather serious accusations. Again, the leading us back to Rome was a big point of that. So the congregation then asserted that they stood with Wyneken. And once the people who made these accusations failed to account for themselves or stand before the council to discuss this, they were excommunicated. Now, one of the comments that Weil had made was that Wyneken was just taking orders from Leah off in Germany. Now, to be sure, Leah at times sent out pastors or prepped missionaries, were sometimes called Leah men, or even Leah's sendlings, which meant kind of a diminutive phrase. His little people he sent off to do his will. So sometimes the language didn't lend itself for making a good impression that it was not Leah who was directing everything. He did have some pretty distinct and detailed directions for the colonies in the Frankenmuth area, for example. But Wyneken was not one of these men hand-trained, hand-crafted, hand-molded by Leah. In fact, Wyneken would say, I'm no more under Leah's orders as I am under the laws of the Emperor of China. So he's saying this is all ridiculous. But of course, one thing that maybe would lead people to think that he was under Leah's control was that Leah wrote a new Lutheran agenda for congregations in North America and dedicated it to Wyneken. So you can see why people would see the connection there, and rightly so, there was a connection. But contrary to belief that Wyneken was doing everything that looked Catholic, Wyneken actually impeded members from doing things that could cause confusion. So some members said he really wanted to have a crucifix and an acolyte. These members wanted to make these things happen. Wyneken knew they would only cause trouble for his own members, who maybe would have a hard time accepting these things, especially if he just insisted on doing it on the basis of his own authority, or just because other people wanted it. So Wyneken actually refrained from doing such things, or even using an agenda formally. So the congregation, as they defended Wyneken, sent their defense to be published in Der Lutheraner with C.F.W. Walther. And they said this, quote, "We hereby declare in the presence of the whole Lutheran Church in America that so long as he has not retracted this, Mr. Weil is a liar who blasphemes God, who has entirely lost his credibility with every honorable person." Here, if you're watching the video, I have the title page and the dedication of Leah's agenda by Wilhelm Leah. And there, in black and white, you see it's dedicated to Frederick Wyneken at that time in Fort Wayne in Indiana. So Wyneken's congregation further asserted that Wyneken was, quote, a faithful preacher of the Lutheran Church. So while other Lutherans in Baltimore often shunned Wyneken, like Weil, Morris was one, as I had said, was drawn into his circle who would visit Wyneken. In fact, Morris was one who in his memoirs would speak very highly of Wyneken. In fact, he concluded his book, 50 Years in the Lutheran Ministry, with 10 pages talking about Wyneken's life. He basically translated sections from Lindemann's biography, but he would add his own comments and introduction to it. He saw Wyneken as a model pastor and also a very genuine Lutheran leader. But Wyneken was not, Morris was not the only pastor who befriended Wyneken and saw insight from him, especially on confessional matters. Another, even more famous Lutheran pastor in Baltimore sought out Wyneken. I have a newspaper clipping here for you to see. It's an interesting comparison to what was going on. It's from a very young Charles Porterfield Krauth, who many of you may know from church history as a leader, a founder, an outspoken confessional voice, and leader of the General Council, which stood in opposition to the General Synod. But this newspaper clipping is posted by a young Pastor Krauth, and it's advertising a union service where he's trying to drum up excitement. The Second English Lutheran Church and the Sixth Presbyterian Church will have a joint service. Everyone's invited. This will be great. So early on, Krauth had a very non-confessional view on some things, and he was pro-union. But around this time, around 1847, so 2 years after that Philadelphia conference, Krauth also is starting to think things through deeply. It's not just Wyneken, of course. there's always been this confessional undercurrent even in the General Synod. But Wyneken's there. Wyneken was a prominent and perhaps the first outspoken voice on this issue. So Krauth is also visiting Wyneken, and it's interesting how he's borrowing confessional books from Wyneken. And then it turns out Krauth is writing back to his father in Gettysburg because he says, well, Wyneken's interested to see if you have this or that book, and you send this over. So there was a confessional Lutheran book exchange between Gettysburg and Baltimore and Wyneken and the Krauths. And this has long mostly gone unreported in the story of confessionalism and the forming of the General Council, that Wyneken was one of the key players there. We also have another quote giving us some insight on that from August Hoyer, who was one of these pastors sent over by Wilhelm Leah. He's writing back to Leah in the year 1848. He says, quote, "Everywhere one comes to the certain realization that without a certain confession, the efforts of the Romanists and the sects cannot be resisted. Wyneken's house is the gathering place for the visiting professors from Gettysburg, the missionaries, and so on. Hardly a day goes by on which, especially at this time, no foreign preacher or teacher comes." So Hoyer is temporarily staying with Wyneken's at this time. He'll be a pastor in the surrounding area shortly if he wasn't already. So he's also there in the house giving a first-hand account of what's happening. And you have all these Lutheran pastors, both foreign and native to the area, who really want to discuss confessionalism with Wyneken. And again, such an underreported, if ever reported, part of the story of Wyneken's influence on the East Coast Lutherans. Now, Wyneken did step out of the General Synod, though. It seems as if he let, and like Krauth and Morris kind of deal with it. They have deeper connections, might be listened to a bit more. And Wyneken, in those early months right after the General Synod convention under the attacks of Weil, did feel as if he were totally alone. Morris hadn't come back yet from Germany with his new perspective. Krauth hadn't quite started knocking on his door for books. So for about a year or so, Wyneken felt utterly alone, utterly under attack by General Synod Lutherans. So he left the General Synod, and that's why he started those pre-Missouri meetings. And Lindemann would write in his biography just a general observation about Wyneken. At first, it seemed as if Wyneken wanted to fight every confrontation, solve every problem. Yet, Lindemann would go on to say, quote, "Ultimately, Wyneken recognized the need to prioritize efforts. He would later offer advice on how to deal with obstacles in the ministry. He would say, quote, 'If you cannot lift them, let them lay and just walk around them,' end quote." So Wyneken, as a young pastor now, 7-8 years into his ministry, was learning some, maybe you might say, practical ministry lessons that, yeah, you may want to be the one who solves every problem, but kind of look at where God has placed you to do good. So Wyneken was focused more on those German immigrant populations and their pastors, and henceforth would be part of the Missouri Synod. But he gave the more than the good old college try. He thoroughly tried to turn both the Synod of the West and the General Synod around. And one wonders, right, if he had waited it out, if he had worked more with Krauth and Morris, if he would have been a General Synod leader. But eventually his confessional principles probably would have made that incompatible, just the way it panned out. But a rather interesting hypothetical, what would have happened given a slightly different timeline. So the last arena we're going to talk about today, about contesting Lutheran identity in Baltimore with Wyneken, is on an entirely different front from dealing with Lutheran identity in his own congregation, or more broadly with the General Synod and Lutherans on the other side of the Atlantic. It starts off with a brief little newspaper announcement. The Second German Lutheran Church made a resolution that, quote, "Only the pastor is to officiate at funerals. Members of other organizations are not to speak at burials in the congregation cemetery," end quote. Okay? They made a rule, they made a ruling. You can kind of see why you may want to do that. This is a religious service. The pastor is the one called to speak at a religious burial committal, right? A practice still followed by many of us today, where this is a religious ceremony. We don't just make this speech time. If you want to talk about your loved one, maybe find a slightly different time or setting to do that. But this is actually directed at something a little bit more specific than just family members wishing to speak, perhaps without quality control. What had happened was, with the Oddfellows' huge presence in Baltimore in that area, they assumed that if they had a member, that they would also get to be very official, very ceremonial, very visible, very prominent in the funeral procession and even in the burial process itself, with all their pseudo-religious trappings. Now, it is said that Wyneken is the first pastor, at least Lutheran pastor in America, to publicly oppose secret societies. This is from a book called American Lutheran Biographies from the 1890s. And ever since that was put in print, that's kind of been the story. Wyneken was the first Lutheran to oppose the lodge. Now, certainly other Christians, the Catholic Church and some Baptist groups and others were very anti-Freemason for their pseudo-religious pretensions, and the Oddfellows kind of fit the bill for this too. So certainly not the first or only Christian to do this, but I've seen in my newspaper clippings quite a few stories of Lutheran pastors going along with all this sort of thing, Methodists embracing the Oddfellows and such. So it was certainly not a uniform reaction to these secret social societies. So I have here, for those watching the video, clippings from a contemporary book, and you might say, oh, these are some Christian symbols. Nope, these are all things that the Oddfellows have used as symbols. They have an ark, just like the Ark of the Covenant. They have a snake on a staff. They have a lamb. Got some pseudo-Trinitarian things. They got 3 rings bound together. They have the all-seeing eye, traditionally a symbol of God's omniscience. All of this stuff, they aren't even trying to pretend to be just a secular social club. Another symbol here showing the Bible and a coffin. They are very much interested in presenting themselves as a spiritual, pseudo-religious sort of organization. Of course, they are also trying to be a rather open spiritual society. They deny the Christian exclusive doctrine that you must believe in Jesus Christ alone to be saved or anything like that. They just want, you need to believe in some kind of higher power, and you're not supposed to criticize any other religions, but we are also a religious group. So they are really forming basically a universalist religion with a lot of trappings. And the ridiculous thing in this book is that they claim that they can trace themselves back to ancient Egypt, right? This is exactly what the ancient Egyptians were doing, and we're just part of that same worldwide religion, okay? So they're also very visible in public civic affairs. For example, in 1839, they marched through Washington, D.C., and the newspapers describe it as, quote, the most splendid civic procession ever seen. They had hundreds of lodge members, all men, walk down Pennsylvania Avenue with their swords and banners and fasces, ram's horn, hourglass, Ark of the Covenant, and so on and so on. All these symbols, including something called a golden pot of manna. I do not know what a golden pot of manna is, but to them, it's part of their mystical symbolisms. So there were some times where they showed up at grave sites, let's say like a Catholic burial, and they were confronted. One time the priest just up and left because he said, I was deceived by this member. He said he wasn't part of these societies, and apparently he is. And so on. Other times, the church, whichever denomination may have been, was trying to get ahead of the funeral, trying to avoid the Oddfellows making an appearance with the procession and all of this regalia, and said, well, please respect the wishes of the family and don't show up. Yeah, the Oddfellows would be writing this now in the public paper, the Baltimore Sun, boasting and whining and complaining, saying, well, we are part and portion of this great American republic. We demand to be visibly present and appreciated for all we are and all we do. They were supposed to be like a benevolent society. So they thought that all their charity, all their good works in the public square earned them a seat, earned them a place at pretty much anything going on with any sort of tangential connection. So they were actually being rather obnoxious and obtrusive, even when they were resisted by religious authorities. All right, so what happened then when they got wind of what the Second German Lutheran Church said about not letting others perform at funerals, at burials, at committals? Well, they also made their own little newspaper clipping, and they said, we're going to give a hint for somebody that if you have someone who's been affiliated with us, don't presume that we won't show up. So what would Wyneken do? Well, Lindemann said that Wyneken, quote, had the impertinence to preach repentance to them, and to maintain that they can only be saved through Jesus Christ. So sometimes lodge members, and particularly the German sportsmen, a different lodge, would show up, and they thought, well, we'll honor this congregation by our presence and all of our costumes. And Wyneken said, you guys just look ridiculous. You're trying to present yourself off with these ritualistic, kind of quasi-liturgical garb. You kind of just look fake and phony. You aren't really representing anything real, in contrast to the Lutheran pastor, right, in his vestments. So he would confront them over not only their appearance but their presence, and he would simply preach the gospel to them, though, and saying, you're trying to trust in your good works and what a good person you are, and showing it off to the whole society, to the whole world. That doesn't count for anything in front of God. So one might think that with all of Wyneken's battles with his own congregation, with the General Synod, with a fellow Lutheran pastor like Charles Weil, just a few blocks away, and now with being confronted with the Odd Fellows, they would march past his house or his church, and they would shout insults at him, that Wyneken must have just hated Baltimore and couldn't get out of there fast enough. Well, 5 years isn't exactly a long time to spend in a call, so there might be some credence to that theory that he was looking for something better. But to say that Wyneken hated Baltimore wouldn't be a fair assessment. In fact, one of the very last words Wyneken ever put into writing was a letter to his friend Alexander Einwächter, who was in Baltimore, and this is what he said. It was a wonderful way to conclude not just our talk about Wyneken and Baltimore, but just to conclude in general our thoughts about the Christian church and our faith that Wyneken preached and proclaimed through the gospel. He said, quote, "It always warms my heart when I think of my dear Baltimore and the many friends and brothers whom the Lord has given me there. May he keep us through his grace in the right faith until our end, that we meet again in heaven before the throne of our blessed Lord and Savior. What a joy that will be."